So, good morning, everyone, once again. And then here I welcome you to creative writing, our very first lesson to open our school year, our semester, first semester on creative writing. Actually, the subject is not totally unfamiliar to me because we offered this subject to the junior high school years and years back. And it came out actually as a conversation between me and Sir Jet before that there are really a number of subjects in the senior high school which were already offered in IA years before. One of those is this creative writing subject. It just did not contain an extensive curriculum compared to what you have and what awaits you for this semester, but the experience of doing one is not anymore totally unfamiliar. Before I go with the introduction to creative writing, I'd like to also know how are your journals? Anything? Yes, Rads? Okay. Okay. By the way, you don't have to pressure yourself of how long your entry is in your journal. Because Rance made mention of a page. It's alright if in one day you've written only something like half of the length of a page, or perhaps for that day you created or composed something that consumed 2 pages. That's fine. It's not the length of the entry that matters in the making of your journal. What's important there is you've noted something significant, something inspiring, something you consider to be worth putting inside that journal of yours for a particular day. In your case, Josh, how many entries have you placed already in your journal? One entry so far? Oh, okay, okay. So that's like 2 pages already with Sunday, Monday, and then hopefully something's going to come out today. You will have reached your third entry. Okay. Okay, that's good. What about Rod? Okay, one entry. It's fine. That's really good. Thank you so much for entertaining or welcoming the idea of doing a journal. Whatever it is that you wrote there, it's up to you. Actually, when I was in college, when our teacher required us to have a journal, any word, even if it's just a word, which I found at that moment quite significant, I actually noted it down. Like for instance, while I was probably doing some assignments in the library when I was in college, and then something so striking came out with that word, and so I noted it down. I didn't lose that. I didn't want to lose that word because again, it came out and it was something quite special when it came out, and so I noted it. My classmates before would write verses in poetry. They would read from books, and then when in poetry or even in prose, when they found significant lines and words from those materials that they read, they took their journals and wrote them down there. You can do the same. Or at home, you might be listening to a song, and then a line in a song struck you so well, it felt like it was meant for you at that moment. And so you might want to consider writing that down because something special with the words that you heard at that moment that I think makes it a good entry to your journal. And hopefully, that's what's going to also help you arrive at a proper or at a better way of approaching our subject this semester, creative writing. What does it mean to do something creative? What does it mean to embrace the world of creativity? To be creative, as your module tells us, by the way, to those who would wish to have an online copy of the module, I do postings of it online like what I did last year. So expect that on Mondays, I'll post copies of my modules on all of my subjects in the respective Edmodo walls. But if you come to school to get a hard copy of your module, that's also totally fine. It's already being prepared the days before that Monday of module distribution. So we have here your module which tells us of what it means to be creative. Accordingly, to be creative means to involve one's imagination or to have original ideas, especially in the production of an artistic work. Creative minds are capable of producing novel or original ideas. What I just thought of, what I just thought of the word creative is to be able to beautify something or provide something that has some form of beauty or artistic appeal. Later on, I realized that the ability to create or craft something original is also a product of a creative mind. Given a situation, given a particular circumstance, the mind that creates something new out from it can be classified or described as a creative mind. A person with a creative mind exercises creativity, which is an act of turning new and imaginative ideas into reality. This is also in one's attempt to perceive the world in newer ways, finding patterns and making connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena and to be able to generate solutions. Again, this has something to do with how the person perceives the world around him and what he wants to do with whatever was perceived. To come up with ideas like if one looks outside the window and might see trees and the emptiness of the space in the surroundings, whatever that person could think of to make the world better, to make that space better than how it just appeared, to determine the patterns in that environment, in that empty space, to determine what seems to be occurring in one venue and how significant or related that is in another location. That's now a product of creativity, the creative mind at work. And this time, we will put our creative minds in a particular channel in our skill on writing. We will incorporate creativity in writing, thereby creating creative writing. This is a mode of writing which is by the making of an original composition and also a product of the creativity of the mind. Again, this creative writing, I'd like to bank on that, is allowing us to create an original composition. But that doesn't mean that we won't learn from people's works, we won't learn from people's approaches. The end, the end of this process, the end of this journey is for us to be able to create one which we could consider our own. Perhaps we could come up with a style which we could consider our own. That's the hope that we look forward to achieving at the end of this road known as creative writing. When we do creative writing, it's possible that we'll approach it in terms of doing fiction or non-fiction. At any rate, the writer sits down to commit an act of literature. The writer commits himself to the making of a literary material. And take note, when we talk of literature, we remind ourselves once again of what literature is. In so many ways, people have agreed that literature is a story of man's experiences. So that's what we are doing. In whatever form or genre it may be, we are sharing an experience which could be taken from our own, which makes it non-fiction, or we could have learned of it from people's real experiences, another non-fiction, or we could come up with a situation with a hypothetical experience. It might be a general experience of many people out there, without any particular reference to reality or to a realistic reference, and so we have possibly come up with fiction. Whatever it may be, we at the moment we have embraced this subject, we are already geared towards creating a product of literature. Now I'd like to, before I proceed, I'd like to ask each of you, which is your comfort? Poetry or prose? When I say poetry, of course, this is in reference to the poems that we know. When I say prose, novels, short stories. Now, I'd like to ask each of you, which is your comfort? Rodney, are you into prose or poetry? Poetry, good. Josh Ray, thank you, Rod. Oh, there are instances where you go with prose, and then sometimes there are moments where you go with poetry. Okay, what about Rans? Rose. So more of your inclination happens to be with prose. Okay, Rans, thank you. Thank you for your answers. In my case, between these two, I actually find more comfort dealing with poetry. For some reasons, when I was in college, in the many literature subjects that I had in college, that was a realization that I made. My inclination is with poetry. I welcome prose. I mean, if I were to do something about prose, I would do it. But between the two, I find interest more in doing many things with poetry. There was even a creative writing workshop that I joined in 2009. I think that was in 2009. And then the entries I submitted are all in poetry, in Cebuano, Boholano poetry. So the language is in the vernacular. It was a set of ballads that I submitted. And then I realized that I think that comfort really comes from poetry. Especially at that moment, I felt like I think poetry is where I would really find myself in. But that doesn't mean that I hate prose. I welcome prose, like what I said earlier. I entertain it. I read prose materials. But between the two, there's just this different relationship that I have with poetry. Whatever your choice is, again, the creative mind is what's going to be demanded from us. And for sure, you have, I mean, look at you right now. You decided, this act of yours, when you decided to pick that background, is already an act of creativity. This is you and your creative mind at work. When you decided to choose that background for yourself, like Josh choosing the ocean jet background, that's the creative mind of Josh at work. Rodney choosing this Zen place. It's like a place of Zen, no? Like a Japanese house. I think that's a Japanese home. That's the creative mind at work. Rand's choosing the shape of Luffy. I think that's the shape of Luffy. It's a creative mind at work. That's creativity. Without knowing it, you are already immersing yourselves to the world of a creative mind. What are the roles of a creative writer? Because sooner or later, you'll be tapping into these roles. The first one is a creative writer gives importance to relevant list, data, and evidence of creative writing. A creative writer recognizes that there are so many things that could influence him or her while doing creative writing. And that person, that creative writer, gives importance to these information. The people that surround him or her are part of these sources of information. And so that creative writer gives importance to those people as well. Where the creative writer lives, that's a source of information or data. And so the creative writer recognizes that environment and gives importance to that environment. I don't know if you've known of people, but there are actually some who would opt to go to isolated places, like they go to farmlands. I can imagine there's like a hill, and people would stay on top of the hill just observing the grasslands. And then there's like a blow of wind, a breeze that blows over that grassland. The grass moves, and then the writer feels the entirety of the environment or of the place. That's the environment being given importance by the writer, because the writer sees the impact of that environment to what he or she might just actually do at the time. Next role of a creative writer. The creative writer shares any experience to others. Definitely. This is in relation to one statement that was said earlier. The creative writer commits him or herself to an act of literature. Since literature is a story of experiences, that's what the creative writer does. Sharing that experiences to others. And again, the experience may be on a real life basis, non-fiction, or it could be one that is not on a real life premise, and that is for fiction. People need to be ready of what experience they're willing to share to others, either in prose or in poetry. And in the same way, the readers actually look forward to what they are going to hear from the writer, or they are going to read from a writer. Take for instance the famous writers like Stephanie Meyer of the present time, Stephanie Meyer, uh, Tolkien, um, J.K. Rowling. When these people created their works, people looked forward to them. Readers looked forward to the writings of these people because they are anticipating already of what experiences these writers are going to divulge in their works. And that's what it means to be a creative writer, to be able to share experiences to others. The last role, a creative writer expresses his or her own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. The works of a creative writer are capable of tapping into these three: thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Not just his own or her own, but actually the creative writer tries to imagine, tries to foresee how people would feel towards the work at hand. Or the creative writer might think, I want the readers to feel this way when they read this part of my work. And so the creative mind once again comes into play in order for that emotion to come out in that part of the writer's work. So those are the three roles of a creative writer. Again, a creative writer gives importance to relevant ideas, data, list, evidences of creative writing, shares experience to others, and expresses his or her own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. We shall now go with the differentiation between creative writing or imaginative writing and technical writing. Imaginative writing there is close to creative writing. Imaginative writing is a form where the writer's thoughts and feelings are expressed in a creative, unique, and poetic way. When I say poetic way, it's not just exclusive for poetry, but in an artistic way. That's what it says. While for technical writing, this is a form of technical communication or documentation. Sometimes it is used with technical vocabularies and highlights processes, classifications, and interpretation. When people make research, are they doing imaginative or technical writing? Obviously, that's technical writing. When people apply for a job and they send a letter of application, the one that you did last year, that's for technical writing. But when someone tries to join a workshop, a literature workshop, and the person there does imaginative or creative writing. When you are told to present a biography, creative writing. When you are requested to create a sonnet, creative writing. But when you are told to create a memo towards employees of your business, technical writing. Both forms of writing aim to communicate something. They do. It's just that for imaginative or creative writing, the attempt to communicate is done in a creative and poetic way, in a style that is artistic. And more than that, the imaginative or creative writing tries to create a product or an output that shares experiences while at the same time taps into the emotions and artistic feel of the readers. Creative and imaginative. Academic writing is another kind of writing, but this is the one which students are probably most immersed in while they continue going through their academic journey. So this is where students make term papers, reflection papers, school researches, assignments. That's a form of academic writing. So you have there a table, there's a table that shows a differentiation between technical and imaginative writing. In terms of content, technical writing is factual and straightforward. It's direct. It doesn't need flowery expressions. It doesn't need any embellishment. It needs to be directly able to convey what it wants to convey. Much more that there are people in the field of technical writing, in the technical world, there are people who don't have the time to go over so many words in a content. So, one needs to be direct. What is this paper? What is this message all about? Directly state what you want to say. And that makes technical writing. While for imaginative or creative writing, symbols, metaphors, they are at work. Surely you don't use symbols when you create a letter of application. You don't say, I, Simplicio Gaduglo the Fifth, I'm applying for a teaching position in your institution because I could see myself as the beacon of a possible beacon which provides uh, brilliance and enlightenment to your school. That's a letter of application is no space, no room for that kind of expression. You don't say, I look forward to working in your company and we would soar up to the skies like how doves, like how eagles reach the heavens up above. You don't say anything like that when people apply for a job. But in the field of technical writing, the field of creative or imaginative writing, words like an eagle, a dove, they are attributed with a lot of interpretations. And that's what makes them creative. That's what injects the imagination and the creativity in them. Next, in terms of audience, when people create when people create a creative writing output or imaginative writing output, it's addressed to a general population. But for technical writing, there's a specific recipient of the material that's being made. Once again, let's consider the letter of application. In the letter of application, there is an inside address. The inside address holds the identity of the person for whom that letter has been made. And so, that's the specific target, specific audience. Or, when you do research, when people do research, they make one because there's a panel who's going to read the work. Or, there's a teacher who's going to score the work. Or, there's a research community to whom that work is going to be shared. compared to creative or imaginative writing, where the audience of the work seems to be quite encompassing of more people. Next, purpose. For technical writing, it is made to inform, instruct, or persuade people. While for creative or imaginative writing, it is made more to entertain, to provoke the creative thinking of readers, and at the same time to captivate your readers' interest and attention. Style. Since the content is of technical writing output is factual and straightforward, its style becomes standardized, formal, at some point academic. But for creative and imaginative writing, the style is artistic. People use informal styles or an informal expression or maybe something that's figurative. I've mentioned of the name of this writer quite a number of times in my sharings with students and with teachers. E. E. Cummings is actually one good writer in poetry. Sometimes, E. Cummings would create poems that look like a flower. I mean, the material would really, the poem itself would take the shape of a flower. And that's an informal style. It really is informal because we are so used to the style of doing poetry where everything is just in stanzas. But here is at least one writer out there who creates a material in the shape of whatever he or she wants to. And that also provides an artistic style to his work. When I had the chance to teach 21st century literature in senior, who's your 21st century lit teacher last year? It was handled by Sir Ash. Did you go as far as what is this? There's this form of poetry. Flarf poetry. When I had this subject taught in one of the schools in the city, I went with Flarf poetry. Flarf poetry is the modern practice of poetry where people are free, not totally free, almost so free of how they do with their poetry. So, with my senior high students at that time, I requested them to do Flarf while doing picture poetry or form poetry. There was one student his name is Ray Arambala. He created a poem of myself. He tried to create a poem of me. And he created the poem in the shape of my face. So, the poem took the outline of my glasses and words make it up. And then there was an outline of my head. And then the words make it up as well. There were others who created a poem about a cat. And the poem actually was shaped like a cat. So that's beyond the standard or the formal style of writing, where people went with a form or shape to correspond to the content of the material. See, a product of creativity. In terms of tone, for technical writing, the tone is objective because it is meant for a particular purpose. While for poetry, for prose, for anything that's a product of creative and imaginative writing, the tone can be subjective. It depends on the poet or it depends on the author of that material. The author injects the tone in the material. Vocabulary, specialized vocabulary is expected for technical writing because it is fitting for a particular purpose. Again, take for instance, if you are doing a letter of application or a business letter, if you do business correspondence, there are terms that apply to that field. There are exclusive terms that are well understood and embraced in the field of business correspondence. You can't just simply use any other term if it's outside of that particular area. When people do experimental researches, the write-up of that experimental research will use definitely terms that are true to the field of that experimentation. In the field of creative writing and imaginative writing, terms or vocabulary happens to be general and evocative. In creative writing, there's a line where we creative writers should subscribe to. We show, we don't tell. Showing and not telling. That should be our goal as creative writers. Which means that when people read from our work, our words should show and should show the kind of emotion, should show the kind of environment we are trying to portray or picture out. Not that we are going to spell everything out for them. For instance, instead of saying, it rained, you can say, I looked at the window and the glasses seemed to have cried from the teardrops of the sky. Di ba? What did those words mean? The ones that I said, the ones which happened to be longer. There were teardrops from the sky, and I looked at the window, and the glasses seemed to cry. That would tell us that there was rain at the time. I was showing to you what I saw. I saw a window glass, and then I saw that there seemed to be teardrops from the sky. I saw that it's as if the glass was also crying. But what I was supposedly trying to tell you was that it was raining. But I didn't just say it rained. That's telling. The words it rained constitute the telling part, while the longer ones I said constitute the showing part. So again, that's showing, not telling. Lastly, in terms of organization, technical writing is expected to be sequential and systematic, so as to convey what its intent really is. But for creative and imaginative writing, it's because of the artistic style that sometimes the material becomes arbitrary. There is no predictable motion of how ideas progress in a creative writing or imaginative writing output. Just imagine novels. For sure, we've had our share of reading novels that begin with something found at the ending. Right? Like, we are welcomed with an ending in this material because what the writer is doing is a flashback. The moment we read into the further pages of the material, we are introduced to the flashback of that ending, which violates the sequential practice in doing technical writing. Questions regarding the differentiation of technical and creative or imaginative writing? Any question? Now I'll proceed with the elements of a creative language. These elements, of course, can also be traced to the elements of creative writing. It begins with imagery. Imagery is the use of the use of language to represent objects, actions, ideas, such that they appeal to one's senses. The use of these would require vivid descriptive language, and it would create a mental picture so that the readers would be able to imagine or have an idea of what is being described with those vivid expressions. There are others who would succeed on this. There are also others who have yet to develop the ability to use vivid descriptions. Not just any description, but vivid descriptions. Descriptions that would appeal so well to the senses of whosoever reads your work or probably hears your work from others. That is imagery. In this context, there are two sets of sensory details that we could actually tap into. What are sensory details? Sensory details are used to intensify the writer's expression and beautify a statement, context, or concept. Sensory details could be external or internal. When we pertain to external sensory details, they are in reference to your five basic senses. So the sense of touch, you have your tactile sense, gustatory sense, olfactory sense, visual sense, and auditory sense. Again, your five basic senses are being tapped into because these external senses are also quite limited to what can be felt externally. For whatever is available externally, your external senses cater to them. But of course, there are things that are to be felt deep inside. And so you have your internal sensory details, which would include emotions, your imagination, your judgment, your illusions, and your humor memory. But I tell you, all of these internal sensory details are products of the mind. In so many conversations with Ma'am Zen, in so many input coming from Ma'am Zen, the heart does not do anything else aside from pumping oxygen and her assisting in the circulation of blood. Di ba the heart does that? It assists in the blood circulation. It pumps oxygen. Does it? What does it? What does it do in your? What does it do in your heart? What does your heart do? It pumps helium. I thought it pumps helium in your case because if it did, then you would have floated already right now. But most definitely, it assists in blood circulation. See? But why is it that the heart is associated with emotions? Our creative minds come here to be at work. When people thought that when they are in love, they would associate it to the heart, that's a product of a creative mind. Because when people are in love, supposedly, it's your mind that has dictated it. Your heart does not dictate you of anything. Because again, your heart only does its assistance in blood circulation. Period. Does your heart provide any emotion? It does not. Thus, it would have been better for someone to say, I love you from the bottom of my, and not, correct, I love you from the bottom of my hypothalamus, which is located somewhere in your brain. Than for you to say, I love you from the bottom of my heart. So what am I to you? A recipient of the blood that you're pumping? You're pumping blood to, wait, it sounds wrong. You're pumping blood to me. Let's forget because it doesn't sound right anymore. But then, because of our use of the creative mind, for some reasons, the heart has been associated with a feeling of love, our feelings, our emotions. It is. It's just a chemical reaction. There's actually a scientific explanation for love, Rans. It is. But the creative mind would think of love more than that. A creative and an imaginative mind would say that the heart evokes the feeling of love. If it evokes the feeling of love, it also evokes the feeling of hate. It can also evoke the feeling of hurt or pain. Look at what our creative minds are doing. In fact, when you see someone just standing by him or herself, the creative mind tries to process the person is lonely. Who knows? The person is just there standing, looking at an empty space, but it's not lonely at all. Just because someone is alone doesn't mean the person is lonely, right? But then the creative mind might be at work observing that person from afar. The person is lonely because he or she is just by him or herself. See, an emotion is at work. The internal sensory detail is at work. Compared to you'll feel the surface of a wall, you'll feel the texture of you'll feel you'll taste something, you'll smell something. Those are your external senses at work. But of course, your external senses and internal senses work together. These sensory details work hand in hand to create something which is welcomed so much in the field of creative writing. Let's go to that example of the person standing by himself or herself. You wouldn't know that if your eyes didn't perceive anything for you. Your sense of sight was at work, your visual sense was at work, an external sense was at work before your internal sense tried to process something. See, they work together to help arrive at an output which works under creative writing. Like now, in your journals, when you try to write an experience there, like maybe something so good happened on that day, that experience probably was heard, seen, or felt physically. If it had something to do with food, you might have tasted something at that time. See, an external sense at work. And then you wrote it down in your journal because you felt some strong connection with that experience. That strong connection is a product of your internal senses. They again have worked together for your creative self to be alive. Next, literal language. Literal language is also part and parcel of creative writing or the creative language. This means exactly what it says in a statement or a sentence. Sir, that's literal. Why is there a place for that in creative language? Take note, before you creatively express something, you need to have a base idea first. That base idea is what you will transform into something creative. Remember my example earlier of it rained? It rained is just literal. But then from it, I tried to come up with an expression which is creative. And so there was a basis. That basis is the one expressed in literal language. And from there comes an expression which was believed to be creative. Next, figurative language. Figurative language actually holds so much creativity and would invite an analytic mind for the expression, for the language to be used and to be understood. Figurative language would include two types of figures. Figurative language would be either figures of speech or figures of sound. Figures of sound are not in the module. I'd like to start with that instead. When we say figures of sound, these are figurative expressions that provide an appeal to how words sound, to how they are perceived through your sense of hearing. In here, we have four: consonance, assonance, alliteration, and onomatopoeia. Do we know the spelling of the four? They're not in the module, so I'll just type them in the chat box. Assonance, consonance, alliteration, and onomatopoeia. These are your four figures of sound. In so many times, people would put onomatopoeia as a figure of speech. But I would always defer. I would beg to differ from them because a figure of speech is an expression that holds an underlying meaning. That further means that figures of speech are not to be understood in their literal meanings. We need to look at them beyond their literal expressions. And for this comes onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia, I'd like to start with onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is an imitation of the sounds in nature or of the environment. Like the crack of the boom of the car was quite surprising. Boom there is a sound produced by the car and it does not bear any underlying thought at all. And for that matter, it doesn't have to be a figure of speech. Or the hissing of the snake frightened me. The hissing is reflective of a sound produced by a snake, which does not correspond to any underlying meaning at all. Thus, not a figure of speech. Rather, it appeals to how something is being heard of. Thus, it's a figure of sound. Alliteration. Alliteration tells us of a dominant consonant sound for the first part of majority of the words in a line. For the first letter, perhaps, of majority of the words in a line or in an expression. For alliteration, this is where your common tongue twisters would come in. Like your Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper. Because the consonant sound is dominant in that line. That makes it an alliteration. Consonance is a dominant consonant sound in any part of a word, in majority of the words in a sentence. For instance, the talking, what is this? The talkative 30, the 30 talkative students are better, the 30 talkative students are better taken to the tower. There is a consonant, a dominant sound. And it's not just the initial sound of every word. Because if you look at talkative, the tiv syllable holds that sound. And it is not the first sound of the word. 30, T. It's not the T is not the consonant, the initial consonant sound. And let's go with assonance. Assonance is a dominant vowel sound. So consonants and alliteration correspond to the dominant consonant sound. The dominant vowel sound is for assonance. All of those four are considered as figures of sound. By Thursday, we proceed with figures of speech and the continuation of the discussion on page 2 of your modules. Any question for whatever we have covered so far this morning in creative writing? Any question? Rands, Rodney, Josh Ray, questions? If there's none, I think we can call it a day. See you on Thursday for the continuation. Goodbye and thank you. For now, let's end our discussion here.